Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Remnant Mentality Ministries Youth Sunday. My name is Marie Rogers. Thank you all for joining in on this Sunday morning. We got a lot to cover a little bit here, and I know that everyone's probably got a lot of different things going on, so we're going to jump right into it. But before we do, you can follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you're on YouTube and you haven't yet subscribed, go on and hit that subscribe key, the word that says subscribe. And in that bell, click on that bell. This turns on your notifications. This way, anytime anyone goes live on Remnant Mentality Ministries, you'll be alerted. And someone's on here every day, Sunday through Saturday, obviously Sunday morning, youth services. And then also our pastor goes on live today, normally on Sundays between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. Or Pacific time, so about 2:30 Central time. So you can catch a word on here every single day. And although we say that this is for youth, it could be for anyone, right? We just want to dedicate a special time for youth to kind of come on and catch it. And we start from the beginning, from Genesis on. And it just helps sometimes when you hear conversation or you're in church and your pastor's going over, scripture, or someone else, you hear a story, you hear names, and you're unfamiliar with where it came from. So it's always good to start from the beginning. So that's exactly what we're doing. We go one chapter every week. Either myself or Miss Carolyn and her husband Gary, they're on, and you can just catch everything from start to finish, the chapter that we cover. Okay. And if you miss something, you can always go back on YouTube and catch it on a recorded version. So again, thank you all for coming in this Sunday morning. We are going to go over Genesis chapter 48. Last week, we're going to talk a little bit about Miss Carolyn and Gary. They covered Genesis chapter 47. And we're going to cover just a little bit of that so we can see where we're getting into today when we start out. When they talked about last week, we found out that Joseph had informed Pharaoh that his family were there, right, already in Egypt, in the town of Goshen. And they had brought their family and their flocks and everything that they had. They were there. So he wanted to let Pharaoh know. Pharaoh was a king. And so Pharaoh told them that, hey, it's okay, settle in Goshen. And if there were any capable men, that were among them, he said, hey, put him in charge of the livestock. Now we know at this time, the famine was very severe. We know that, as a reminder, Joseph said it was going to be 7 years of plenty, right? Where it's going to be overabundance. They were going to enjoy it. And the whole goal was for them to make sure they save and they use their resources wisely. But he also said, following, there was going to be 7 years of famine. Famine is a lack of resource, a lack of water, a lack of food. And this is the period of time that they were in. And what ended up happening is Joseph collected silver from Egypt and from Canaan for the grain that they had purchased. Well, that had eventually run out. And so the people, the Egyptians, they came back to Joseph and said, hey, look, we don't have any more silver. And he says, okay, well, what about your livestock? So then they're using their livestock for grain. And that was good for a year, but then that next year they were out of livestock. And they go back to Joseph and they said, listen, we don't have anything else, except for, we have our land and we have our bodies, and so they offered themselves, hey, we can work on the land, in order to get seed. And so Joseph agreed, and he tells them, he says, okay, listen, he puts out, hey, what they're working for, but he also lets them know, 1/5 of the harvest is going to go to Pharaoh. And then they would be able to keep the other 4/5, as seed. And that was for them and for their family, for food, so that they can take care of their households. And so Joseph made this a law. And we can see many, many, many years later, taxes, when people wonder, where did that come from? Did someone just make it up? We can see way back here in Genesis, essentially, this is what Joseph decided. We also know that at 147 years old, Jacob, he was approaching near his deathbed. His sight, he was losing his sight. He was kind of weak. And he's trying to prepare for things. And he asked Joseph, he says, hey, listen, if you find favor in me, can you do me a favor? Can you treat me kind and be faithful and not bury me? Right? He didn't want to be buried in Egypt. So Joseph promised them. And this actually takes us to today's lesson because, like I said, at this time, Jacob is very weak. He's lost his vision. Joseph finds out when we move into today's lesson, Genesis chapter 48, it tells us that sometime after that conversation, after that happened, Joseph gets word that his father is weaker. So he set out with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. He sets out with them. He loves his dad. He wants to be with his dad. Remember, he had missed out on all those years without being near his dad. And of course, his dad, that was like his favorite son, right? Because his mom, Rachel, that's who Jacob really loved. And so he wanted to be there, of course. And then also tradition wise to go and see the inheritance and see what you're actually going to be getting. And so Joseph is there with his kids. And so Jacob finds out, they tell him, hey, your son Joseph has come to you. So Israel, remember Jacob's name was changed over to Israel. Israel summoned up the strength, and he sits up in the bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, hey, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. So at this point, he is reminiscing about the goodness of God. He's not going in with any pity. He's not going in with any hatred. He loves life. And he's trying to let him know that all the blessings, and when did they start, and where, more importantly, they started, right? He said, so as he begins to tell Joseph this, he says, he said to me, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make many nations come from you, and I will give this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. And so this was like the same promise that God had made to Abraham. But so he's telling them that this is what happened as he's doing this remembrance phase. And so Jacob, we're going to find out here, there's two different parts to this first part where he kind of goes back, right? He's talking to Joseph, and he's talking about the many blessings. And then the second phase that we're going to see is how he wants to bless Joseph and his sons. Well, in this portion, he wanted to talk about how God had blessed him, right? And if we go back and we remember in chapter 28, while Jacob was headed to his uncle Laban's home, where he rested halfway point, he was on his way there because remember he had switched. He said that he was actually the older brother. His father was weak at the time. Isaac was weak and he couldn't see. So same scenario here, and so he switched birthrights and he tricked him so that he would get the blessings of the first son. Well, he's letting him know that on his way there to his uncle Laban's, because his mother told him, "Hey, go there for a while until everything kind of blows over." Because Esau, his twin brother, was pretty upset. He rested, and while he rested, he had this dream, and as he saw God's angels going up and down the staircase. And the Lord said, this is important here, it says, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac, which we know is his dad. He says, I will give you your offspring, the land on which you are lying. This was one of the first encounters he had with God. And once he awoke, he poured oil on that stone, and he named the place Bethel, which was previously called Luz. And he remembered this encounter very clearly. So that's what this verse 3 pretty much is talking about when he's telling them what happened to him at Luz. And again, the same promise that he got, that was the same promise that God gave Abraham. So Jacob is trying to let him know, hey, listen, I've been blessed. And this is where the blessing started, and this is how it started, and I want to do the same thing for you. And all of this, this is through when Jacob was returning to Canaan after spending the 2 decades working for his father-in-law in Paddan Aram, where he was hiding from his brother Esau. So Jacob has held on to this promise from God throughout his life, right? It's been something, started out kind of fearful, left from his home where he knew in Canaan, going over into this is where he left with his where he was with his mom and dad, and his dad wanted him to go back to where the family was at. Even he was fearful because he didn't know anyone, right? All the way up to everything that's happened up until now. He didn't want to necessarily come to Egypt. He came in because of the famine. Lo and behold, he ended up staying there for 17 years. But he's always had that promise of God with him. And so that's kind of key to stay faithful. And I know Miss Carolyn talked about it last week about, being prayerful and remaining faithful and loyal, and just trusting God, right? Those are three things that she had pointed out. And we can see clear example here that this is exactly what Jacob does, right? He said, hey, he remained faithful with everything that happened. Now we're going into verse 5 here, it takes us, and it says, your two sons, he tells them, your two sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simon do, or Simeon do. He says, children born to you after them will be yours and will be recorded under the names of your brothers regarding their inheritance. Now, Jacob's main concern here was to bless Joseph, whom he had made his firstborn, and bless them and make their sons the sons of Israel. If we go back to Genesis chapter 34, this is when Simeon and Levi, remember, they killed all the men of Shechem, and in Genesis 35, chapter 22, verse 22, Reuben slept with his father's concubine. So those are the first three born sons for Leah, to Jacob, and they sinned. So they were already being disregarded. So Joseph had kind of taken the kind of replaced one of them, right? Where Reuben, who was the first one, and then Simeon and Levi technically would be Ephraim and Manasseh, taking those places. And that's why he said, hey, they're mine. Essentially, he said, hey, I want to adopt them. Like, they're going to be my sons, not like just my grandsons, so that he'd be able to go ahead and give them these blessings and birthrights. Then he lets it know. He says, when I was returning from Paddan to sorrow, Rachel died along the way, some distance from Ephrath in the land of Canaan. I buried her there along the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. So he's going back to the story about what actually happened to him those many years ago, when he's letting them know, listen, as we were leaving, we were headed back away from, we were some distance from Ephrath, which is in the land of Canaan. His mother gave birth to, Joseph's mother gave birth to his younger brother Benjamin, but she ended up dying right after. And that was in Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 through 20. If you want to read that, exactly what happened, that's where you would be able to find it. But so here, like I said, is where Jacob's kind of reflecting back on the past, because this is kind of the end. And if you've ever been around someone real in their deathbed, this is kind of where they're at. They're trying to go back to some things that's happened in the past, and either they're making it right, or they just remember some good things and passing that on to someone. And this is what Jacob is doing at this point. He is reminiscing a little bit, going back and letting Joseph know some things, because he's trying to get him prepared as well. And in verse 8, it has, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they're my sons. God has given me here. So Israel said, bring them to me and I will bless them. Look at that, right? He goes, now his eyesight was poor because of his old age, so he could hardly see. So Joseph brings them to him, and he kissed him and he embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again, but now God has even let me see your offspring. Then Joseph took them from his father, and he bowed with them, and he faced the ground. So again, as a reminder, Joseph's sons' names are Manasseh, he was the firstborn, and then Ephraim, which he's the second son. So again, Jacob never thought he'd even see his son Joseph again after he was gone, after he was taken and sold into slavery. But by God's grace, he not only saw his son Joseph, but Joseph's children as well, his grandchildren. And even though Joseph was this high official of Egypt, in charge of everything, I mean, Pharaoh had really just gave him this gift of being in charge, he still had this deep respect for his father Jacob. He never went in, and he wasn't disrespectful. He wasn't rude at any point. He carried on with the traditions that he normally would. And here's this greater blessing, because now Jacob has met his grandchildren. So when we go into verse 13, it says, Then Joseph took them both. He's talking about the kids, the two kids, with his right hand, Ephraim toward Israel's left. So if he's facing them, he's got his right hand and he's facing them towards the left. And remember, Ephraim is the second child. Manasseh towards Israel's right hand and brought them to Israel. And this is important how he placed them, because at this time tradition was, the right hand was the hand of strength, the skill, the where the blessings, technically when you were been blessed, it goes through the right hand. And so Joseph strategically did that. He put him in it. He knew his father's vision wasn't that great, so he wanted to get it right. He wanted to make sure there was no mistakes. But instead, Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hand, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Again, this is significant because in the Bible, there's this idea that the favor position is with the right hand. And Joseph knew this. But Israel, so Jacob, he intended this to grant a greater blessing to the younger sibling, in this case, Ephraim. So we go into verse 15, it says, then he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of their fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow up to be numerous within the land. Well, Jacob blessed Joseph through blessing his children. Joseph is doubly blessed by seeing Ephraim and Manasseh blessed. Jacob understands and knows his provision had come from God. He believes if God doesn't sustain him, he won't be sustained. He says God has fed him all those days of his life. Jacob knew both of them knew what he was doing. Now this is where it gets odd, and where I thought about this for a minute, because Joseph knew the tradition. He knew what it meant to be blessed. He knew the firstborn. He knew his father's vision was weakened. And so he made sure, hey, I'm going to put them in the right place. So all his father has to do technically is reach his hand out. Jacob, weakened vision and all, it's almost like none of that mattered. He couldn't clearly see them. But this is that spirit in him, right? That he was able to know exactly what Joseph was doing, crisscross, and get it right. And we're going to find out why he said he did that, okay? This testimony, though, is one of grace for Jacob. It's not of a personal merit. It's how faithful God has been to him. Not one time did Jacob proclaim that, hey, I'm the king, I'm the best, this is what I have for you. He's saying through God, everything, he always honored God. He always put him out there. He never took any credit on his own. If we move into verse 17, it says, when Joseph, now remember this, because remember the movement and the placement for Joseph. When Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was a mistake. So he was displeased, because he's like, what is happening here? And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's hand to Manasseh's. But Joseph said to his father, not that way, my father. He wasn't rude when he said it, but he's trying to say, hey, Dad, I'm helping you out here. I know your vision's bad. And he says, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head, because he wanted to make sure he got it right. I looked at this and I saw it two ways also. I said, well, maybe if we go back to his father, Isaac, what happened with Isaac, he wants to make sure, not that he was alive, obviously, but could it be that this has been passed on and they knew he wanted to make sure that there wasn't any trickery in this, that, hey, I'm letting you know who the oldest one is, so this is the one that you can bless. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He says, he too will become a tribe. He too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be a greater than he, and his offspring will become a populous nation. So this multitude of nations, he's letting them know. So he blessed them that day, putting Ephraim before Manasseh, when he said, the nation Israel will evoke blessing by you, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Again, Joseph positions, it was intentional, so the order could receive the right hand blessing according to custom. Jacob made Joseph understand that he knew what he did and that it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a joke, he wasn't trying to humor him. And it definitely wasn't from a partial affection to one more than the other, but from a spirit of prophecy and in compliance with the divine counsels. God, in bestowing his blessings upon his people, gives more to some than others, right? Some of us has more gift than others, more graces, more comforts, more of the good things in life. That's just how God has us positioned. And that's how we kind of all work together. We don't all have the same thing, but we all have that grace from God. And think about it. Many of us have gone through phases in our lives and we've seen people, whether it's at work or school, in the store, wherever, and we're saying, how did that person end up with that? Why did he? We start to think like that. And the thing is, because a lot of things people go by custom. Well, he's like, we're not doing it by custom here, right? This is what God is telling me. We're going to go in the direction of God. And so that's key when we remember this is, or when we think about this. Whenever we're making decisions, let's not try to make them off emotion. Let's try to make decisions based off of what our mom or our dad did or what somebody may think we should do. What is God telling us to do? Because ultimately, that's what's going to end up happening anyway. So we might as well get it right at first. Let's go to God and ask, what is God telling us to do? And that's exactly what Jacob did. And remember, in the very beginning, what I said is, Jacob has always believed in his blessing and his grace from God. And he's always said, hey, I know I'm blessed. I know I'm protected. I have the favor. And that's what he's lived in. So he knew that this was right. Even though at the time, at the moment, Joseph couldn't see it. We're going to, this brings us to our last two verses. Israel said to Joseph, look, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. This is sort of a sign of the passing of the torch from Israel to Joseph, right? You had Abraham to Isaac, then Isaac to Jacob, and now Jacob to Joseph. And I read this in one of the commentaries. It said God gives a mature believer the opportunity to encourage others with the promise of God's presence, right? Jacob gives this reassurance to Joseph. Look, he says, even after I die, don't worry about it. God is still with you, Joseph, and your family. God will bring them back. He's letting you know God's going to bring you back to the land of promise in Canaan. Because ultimately, that's what he wanted. He said it in the very beginning, right? And so he's letting him know that I know you're in Egypt now. I know Pharaoh has you. You're doing some things here. I just need you to trust. I just need you to have faith in what I'm doing and just believe in God. So he's telling them this, which I don't know that Joseph would have a hard time with it, because Joseph got to say, hey, I'm pretty fair with myself, because not only did he dream those dreams came true to the T. And he didn't hold any grudges. He was very forgiving. He still took care of his family, his brothers included, even though he knew exactly what they did to him. It turned out to be the best thing for him, right? Turned out for good for him. And then in this, the last verse 22, over and above what I'm giving your brothers, I'm giving you the one mountain slope, this Shechem, right? Joseph's burial place. He says that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. When Jacob has given Joseph a double portion of his inheritance by making Joseph two oldest sons full heirs along with his brothers. Jacob has a specific, this area in Canaan. And when Jacob was in Canaan, he battled for control over a portion of the land from the Amorites, and he deeded the land to Joseph. The descendants of Joseph would take this land some 400 years later. So he's letting them know, listen, You, you don't have to worry about anything, right? Even if you can't see it right now, it's all set up for you and for your descendants. One of the key lessons in this particular chapter, and it carried on similar from chapter 47 as far as the trust and having faith and forgiving. This chapter is about the blessing Jacob pronounces over Joseph's oldest two sons. It was unheard of. It hadn't been done before. Everyone before, right? It was had to go to the first, had to go to the first, had to go to the first. And in this particular case, Jacob's like uh, he always considered Joseph and Benjamin like his first and second, right? Because even though he did not marry uh, Rachel first, he married Leah. He always looked at that he married Leah, but it wasn't. It was he kind of got tricked into it by Laban, right? And so those were his favorite. Rachel was the love of his life, and he claimed them as his own, right? And he claimed those his two grandsons as his own kids, so that they received a full portion of the inheritance. And this means that Joseph's family will receive the double portion by him doing so. And that kind of wraps up this particular chapter. We're going to see what happens next week when we know, like I said, Jacob was weak. We're going to see what happens next in the next chapter. We'll cover that next week. If he's still hanging on, if there's any bitterness from the other brothers, we're gonna, as we go through these chapters, we're gonna see some of that. And you can kind of do some reading, but what do you think about some of those things? And what do you think about what Jacob actually did? Do you think it's right? Do you think it's fair? Or do you think, hey, it doesn't matter necessarily what we think? If God planned for that, if that's what God wanted, is that the best thing and is that the right thing? And ultimately, the answer, you'll probably come back and say, yes, if this is what God proposed, if this is in God's plans, it's the same thing today as we do things. A lot of times we find ourselves, and we talk about this all the time, right? We do things in our own way because we either take shortcuts or because this is the way it's always done. And we find out that we end up taking all these steps forward to have to start all the way back because we weren't on the track that God had for us. So I certainly do hope that you got something from this. If nothing else, it should have closed up some of those gaps as far as what happened once they were in Egypt and him meeting his grandkids. And we're going to see, like I said, what happens on this next phase. Thank you, Mr. Meyer, for chiming in as well. Thank you very much. So again, we will be back here next week, or I'll be back next Sunday, about the same time, between 8:30 and 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to go over Genesis chapter 49. Always welcome to read ahead, get an idea. Remember, like I said earlier, though, share it with someone. Talk about it so that when we come on next week, you have an idea. Or if you have questions, go ahead and feel free, put them in the chat box. I'll look through them throughout the week. And if there's any questions, then I'll go back and we'll kind of cover this before jumping into Genesis chapter 49. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And until next week, stay safe, be blessed, have a wonderful week. See you next Sunday. Goodbye.